In past centuries, before the age of radio and modern communication, it wasn't uncommon for some battles to continue even after a war had officially ended. One reason for this is that some battles were taking place in distant regions, far from where the peace treaty might be signed. The long distance and lack of any method to get the word out quickly made it difficult to stop these battles until someone could actually get there and tell them in person. One such battle was called the Battle of New Orleans, which occurred during the War of 1812. After the famous Revolutionary War of 1776 between America and Great Britain, there was a less famous war called the War of 1812, where America and Great Britain had a go at it one more time. This war only lasted about 2 years, and a treaty ending the war was signed in December of 1814. However, it was signed in Europe, which was quite a distance from where some of the battles were still being fought in America. One such battle was in New Orleans, where fighting had been going on for about 4 months. New Orleans was over 4,800 miles away from where the treaty was signed, and the battle continued until January of 1815, when they finally got word that the war was actually already over. Nowadays, it's less likely for this kind of thing to happen, mainly because communication is just much better. Today, a soldier could get word from their leaders within minutes instead of weeks, which would end any fighting instantly. But even in modern times, have you ever wondered, what if a soldier was stranded in a remote location and lost their ability to communicate in any way? Could it be possible that such a soldier could believe a war was still going on, even if it had already ended? Under the right circumstances, it's not unreasonable to think that this is a likely scenario, and perhaps one could even see this lasting weeks or even months before the truth was discovered. But what if it took much longer? Like years? Like close to 30 years? What, you ask? How could that even be possible? That story starts now.
Outland Radio.
On December 7th, 1941, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, forcing a once reluctant America into World War II. 3 years later, in December of 1944, at the age of 22, Hiroo Onoda was a soldier and second lieutenant with the Japanese Army. He was trained as an intelligence officer in guerrilla warfare and assigned to the island of Lubang in the Philippines. Japan wasn't actually at war with the Philippines, but it occupied certain territories and tried to maintain those areas because of the importance of their strategic location. Onoda was given orders to destroy the airstrip and docks and maintain control of the island. He was instructed to never surrender nor take his own life, but await further orders from his commanding officer. When he first arrived, he was met by other Japanese soldiers who had been assigned there previously. They maintained the island until February of 1945, when U.S. and Philippine forces attacked and took the island. Every Japanese soldier in the battle either surrendered or was killed except for Onoda and 3 other men. They retreated and took refuge in the jungle in the mountains of Lubang. World War II came to an end only about 6 months later, after the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This should have ended the war for Onoda as well, but he and the other men didn't have any way of knowing. There had been no communication with his superior officers from the outside world. Onoda and the other 3 men were lone soldiers, isolated in the jungles of a remote island somewhere in the Philippines, still waiting to hear from their commanding officers. Without further instructions, Onoda continued with the last orders he'd been given, to defend the island against outside forces and keep it secure for Japan. He and the other men lived in the jungle, surviving on bananas, coconuts, and anything they could find. He and his men actually became a nuisance to those who lived there. They would conduct raids on homes and farms, stealing food and supplies. He burned crops and even killed people. According to the locals who lived there, Onoda and his men had been responsible for the death of at least 30 people. Some people suspected that there were rogue Japanese soldiers still living on the island, and they made attempts to communicate with them. Leaflets and flyers were dropped announcing that the war had ended. Onoda saw the leaflets, but refused to believe what he read. In 1949, one of Onoda's men by the name of Akatsu became convinced that the war was actually over, and he left the rest of the group. He lived alone in the jungle for about 6 months. Exhausted and malnourished, he finally surrendered to the Philippine forces in 1950. They were friendly to him, and he tried to help them find the other 3 men. However, Onoda and the others considered this an act of betrayal. Onoda now only had 2 men he could trust, Corporal Shimada and Private Kazuka. After his surrender, Akatsu was flown back to Japan and found Onoda's brother and told him the men were still alive and in hiding. Onoda's brother begged the Japanese government to try to find them. However, the Philippine government would not cooperate with the Japanese and refused to allow them near the island. At one point, letters from friends and family were dropped into the jungle urging the men to come home. But Onoda and his men believed it was all propaganda distributed by the enemy and a trick to bring them out of hiding. In 1952, Onoda and the other two men ambushed a group of fishermen in the morning. One of the fishermen fired back and hit Onoda's finger. Another bullet penetrated the leg of Shimada. Onoda and his men retreated, and Onoda cared for Shimada's leg and nursed him back to health. Later, in 1954, Onoda and Shimada were napping by the coast and were suddenly caught off guard when an armed group of men attacked them. Shimada was shot and died on the scene. News of Shimada's death made its way back to Japan, and the Philippine government authorized a Japanese rescue team to try to find the remaining men on the island. They made every effort, including spreading more leaflets and flyers. But Onoda and Kazuka had already made their way northeast and away from the rescue team. In 1965, Ferdinand Marcos became the president of the Philippines. He wanted good relations with the Japanese, who had made a strong financial recovery after the war. It was in that same year that Hiroo Onoda found a modern radio with batteries which, ironically, had been made in Japan. With that radio, he could listen to modern broadcasts, and it was said that he enjoyed listening to music and news stations. At this point, one might wonder if Onoda still truly believed that the war hadn't already come to an end. It seems that there had been plenty of evidence available for him to see the truth by this time. But who knows what state of mind he was in after dedicating half his life, over 20 years in the jungle, believing he was still fighting in a war. By the 1970s, Onoda and Kazuka were a mere memory to the Japanese. Most didn't even know if they were still alive. However, Onoda and Kazuka made it a habit to constantly remind the locals that they were there. December of 1972 was one such day. Onoda and Kazuka were going through a regular routine of setting fire to fields and sacks of dried rice. However, on that day, they were surprised to see police arrive earlier than expected, and gunfire ensued. Kazuka was fatally shot and fell to the ground. Onoda got away, but was now a lone survivor, a rogue soldier from a time long ago, still holding on to the orders given to him nearly 30 years earlier. In 1974, a young Japanese hippie named Norio Suzuki decided to go on an adventure around the world with 3 specific goals in mind. He wanted to find Lieutenant Onoda, a panda, and the abominable snowman, in that order. Ironically, he found Onoda after only 4 days of searching for him on Lubang. Suzuki and Onoda became friends, but Onoda still didn't believe him when he told him that the war had ended 30 years earlier. Onoda said that he would only surrender if his commanding officer came to relieve him of his duty. Suzuki flew back to Japan and found his commanding officer, Taniguchi, who was now a bookseller. With the cooperation of both the Japanese and Philippine governments, Taniguchi flew to Lubang, found Onoda, and officially relieved him of his duty. Onoda surrendered to the Philippine government, after which he was pardoned by Ferdinand Marcos for all of his crimes. Onoda was then flown home to Japan, where he received a hero's welcome by his own people. After 30 years of war in the jungle, Hiroo Onoda started a new life. He married and purchased a ranch in Brazil with his brother, where he would spend 3 months of each year raising cattle and then spend the rest of the time in Japan. Hiroo Onoda died in 2014 at the age of 91. There's no question that having confidence in our decisions is a good quality to have, and so is loyalty to a cause we believe in. But given the fact that our knowledge of the world is limited to the short time we've spent on it, not to mention that the world itself seems to change almost daily, it might be a good idea to stay humble, stay teachable, and consider that maybe we're not always right, and maybe there are things out there that we simply don't know. It doesn't mean we have to abandon all of our beliefs, especially those rooted in real truth, but it certainly doesn't hurt every once in a while to walk over to the edge of the jungle, poke our heads out, and take a look around, just to make sure we're not still fighting a war that we probably should have stopped fighting nearly 30 years ago.